with Caitlyn, and there is definitely something going on within the locker room of the Indiana Fever, and that's what we're finna talk about right now. Live On American Life stated he's just been sharing a bunch of shit all day. He stated this one bull stuff. It makes it even worse. If they shall scrub,
there is a term in corporate law and consumer protection statutes that most people outside of legal and regulatory circles rarely encounter in everyday conversation. It is precise, it is legally defined, and it carries serious institutional consequences when it is applied. The term is bait and switch fraud. In regulated industries, bait and switch is not merely an ethical failure or a public relations problem. It is the kind of conduct that triggers federal investigations, invites class action litigation, and produces executive-level accountability that can reshape the leadership structure of an entire organization. It describes a very specific sequence of events. A premium product is knowingly marketed to consumers. Full payment is secured based on that marketing. And then, at the precise moment when the customer's practical ability to seek a remedy has expired, an inferior product is deliberately substituted in its place. On a Wednesday night in June 2026, at Gainbridge Fieldhouse in Indianapolis, Indiana, the front office of the Indiana Fever appears to have decided that this framework was not a legal and ethical boundary to be respected. It was an operational tool. What happened that night? The sequence of decisions that led to it, the institutional culture that enabled it, and the documented regulatory failures that accompanied it, is rapidly becoming the most
for Caitlyn and wouldn't show up if they pulled this yesterday. They've lost the fans' trust for the third year in a row. Yes, they have. Now, during the time of me watching this game, I started looking at the stands, and in the stands, there was nobody there. Like, the game, like, it was reported.
Consequential front office scandal of the entire 2026 WNBA season. And the most troubling part is not what happened on the basketball floor. It is what the paper trail, the timestamps, the CBA language, and the visual evidence all reveal about how this franchise is being managed at the highest levels of its organizational structure. This is not editorializing. This is not speculation dressed up in analytical language. This is a documented, evidence-based examination of the Indiana Fever's own actions, placed directly against the specific contractual obligations they are legally bound to fulfill. And the collision between those two things speaks for itself with extraordinary clarity. Before any discussion of basketball decisions, coaching philosophies, or injury management protocols is meaningful, the governing document must be established. The WNBA Collective Bargaining Agreement is not a set of suggestions. It is a binding contractual framework that defines the rights and obligations of every party in the professional relationship between the league, its franchises, and its players. And one of its most clearly written, non-discretionary provisions concerns injury reporting. Under the CBA's mandatory reporting framework, WNBA franchises are required to submit complete injury, illness, and rest designations for all roster players to the league office by 5:00 p.m. local time on the day preceding any scheduled game. This requirement was not inserted into the agreement as administrative formality.
Of information about 1 p.m. local time on that day. So is they saying that the Indiana Fever is getting in trouble? Somebody says, since this is a home game, they clearly did this to fleece their own fans. Damn. How do you feel, Indiana Fever? You like it when your team takes a fine to make people pack a home game under false pretense? Wow, is they finna get a...
It exists for a specific, well-defined purpose, to ensure that consumers, betting markets, traveling fans, and all other stakeholders who make financial and logistical decisions based on player availability have access to accurate and timely information before those decisions become irreversible. The provision contains exactly one exemption. That exemption applies exclusively to the second night of a back-to-back scheduling situation, where the compressed timeline between games makes the 5:00 p.m. prior day deadline physically impossible to meet. The Indiana Fever's home game against the expansion Portland Fire was not the second night of a back-to-back. There is no ambiguity in that determination. It is a calendar fact. The exemption did not apply. The obligation was absolute. So the question that flows directly from that factual foundation is as straightforward as any institutional question can be. What did the Indiana Fever's official injury report, submitted by 5:00 p.m. the day before the Portland game, say about Caitlyn Clark? Based on all available reporting and documentation from that period, the answer appears to be nothing. No designation, no participation status classification, no medical notation of any kind. The player who is, by any measurable commercial metric, the singular economic engine of the Indiana Fever franchise, the player whose presence drives broadcast ratings, secondary market ticket pricing, road game attendance surges across the entire league, and sponsorship valuations that extend to the organizational level, did not appear on the mandatory pre-game reporting documentation at all. That omission is not a clerical oversight. It is not an administrative error attributable to an overworked staff member forgetting to file a form. It is a documented failure to comply with a binding CBA obligation, and it has
according to the Indiana Fever. Now, somebody sent me this photo of Caitlyn Clark at practice yesterday. And this photo right here shows Caitlyn Clark's demeanor yesterday at practice. So as you guys can see there, it's almost like they're making Caitlyn Clark take a timeout. Not in game terms, but
consequences that extend well beyond the basketball operations department. To understand why the reporting violation matters in institutional terms, the financial architecture of a WNBA home game night must be examined honestly. When a professional sports franchise hosts a game at its home arena, revenue is not generated through a single transaction. It flows through multiple interdependent streams simultaneously. Ticket sales, both season package and individual game purchases, represent the primary revenue layer. But parking revenue, concession revenue, and merchandise revenue all operate in parallel, and all of them are directly correlated with attendance volume and consumer engagement levels. Every one of those revenue streams for the Portland Fire game was generated under the reasonable, well-founded consumer assumption that Caitlyn Clark would be available and playing. Families in Indiana and neighboring states who planned travel to Indianapolis, booked hotel accommodations, arranged childcare, and purchased tickets at secondary market prices that were elevated specifically because of Clark's expected presence made those decisions before any information suggesting otherwise was available to them. The parking fees were collected after those families arrived at the arena. The concession purchases happened inside the building. The merch
some of this game, I started looking at the stands, and in the stands, there was nobody there. Like the game, like it was reported earlier that the Fever had the 5th ranked attendance.
Merchandise transactions occurred at the point of sale. And only after all of those financial commitments had become practically irreversible did any public announcement regarding Clark's unavailability emerge. The sequence of that timeline is the institutional question. It is the difference between a franchise managing a legitimate last-minute medical development and a franchise making a calculated decision to suppress material information until consumer exposure to financial loss was maximized. The financial calculation is not complicated, and the Indiana Fever front office is fully capable of running the numbers. If Clark's absence had been reported at 5:00 p.m. the previous day, as the CBA unambiguously requires, the downstream effects on all of those revenue streams would have been immediate and measurable. Season ticket holders would have reconsidered whether to attend in person. Casual fans planning day of purchases would have paused before committing. The secondary market would have corrected downward in pricing, visibly and rapidly. The announced capacity crowd that generated full arena-level revenue across every stream would, in all probability, not have materialized at that financial scale. The franchise appears to have concluded, through whatever internal process produced this decision, that the financial exposure from a potential CBA compliance fine was a smaller number than the financial benefit of maintaining Clark's availability status through the full revenue collection window. That is not a basketball operations decision. That is a front office financial calculation, made with full awareness of its implications for the consumers who trust
until the fine be appointed. But remember, you guys heard it here first. If this is correct, a fine is definitely coming to Indiana Fever way. for falsifying player status before game day activities. Wow!
The franchise's implicit representation that the product being sold was the product that would be delivered. The reporting violation does not exist in isolation. It connects to a broader institutional context that the precautionary rest narrative cannot adequately explain, and the visual evidence that has accumulated around this situation makes that narrative increasingly difficult to sustain under any honest scrutiny. The viral sideline footage from the game immediately preceding the Portland matchup has been widely viewed and documented. It captured Caitlyn Clark in a visible, forceful physical disengagement from an interaction with head coach Stephanie White and assistant coach Brian January. The nature of that disengagement, the intensity of the body language, the clarity with which Clark communicated that she had reached a defined limit was not consistent with routine in-game communication between a coaching staff and a player. It was consistent with a dispute of meaningful depth that had reached an acute public expression point. In professional sports organizations, when a player of Clark's commercial significance has a documented sideline interaction of that character, the institutional priority is unambiguous: de-escalation, communication, resolution. The relationship between a franchise and its most valuable asset does not benefit from being allowed to deteriorate further, and every competent front office in professional sports understands that principle as a foundational element of roster management. The photographic documentation from the Fever's practice facility in the days immediately surrounding that incident tells a visual story that is even harder to reconcile with the official framing. Clark's positioning relative to the rest of the roster and coaching staff, physically isolated, visibly disengaged, removed from the normal integrated flow of a professional practice environment, does not reflect the standard presentation of an athlete managing a back complaint through a modified participation protocol. Athletes dealing with genuine physical ailments operate within modified practice structures. They work in collaboration with the training staff. They remain embedded in the team's daily operational rhythm, participating in film sessions, positional meetings, and whatever physical activities their condition permits. Their presence in the practice environment reflects the medical staff's management of their return to play progression. What was photographically documented during this period does not reflect any of those patterns. Combination of the sideline incident footage, the practice facility photographs, and the CBA reporting failure produces a factual picture that the back injury narrative simply cannot account for. These data points do not tell the story of a franchise carefully managing a player's physical health. They tell the story of an institutional environment experiencing a significant internal conflict that is being actively obscured from public view through the application of medically adjacent language. Numbers can be managed, official statements can be carefully constructed, but arena atmosphere is organic, and on the night the Indiana Fever hosted the Portland Fire without Caitlyn Clark on the active roster, Gainbridge Fieldhouse told the honest version of the story. The broadcast footage and contemporaneous documentation of the building's atmosphere during that game present a problem for anyone attempting to argue that the franchise made the right institutional decision. The observable crowd engagement, the noise level, the baseline intensity that a competitive WNBA home game should generate naturally, was not present at the level that Gainbridge Fieldhouse produces when Clark is playing. The arena was physically occupied by fans who had arrived expecting a specific product and received a different one. The investment was present. The emotional engagement was not. This matters beyond its symbolic dimension because arena atmosphere is a commercial product. It is part of what the consumer is purchasing when they buy a ticket to a professional sporting event. It is part of what broadcast partners are distributing when they carry the game nationally. It is part of what sponsors are paying for when they place their brands in proximity to a WNBA franchise's home game presentation. None of those elements perform at their expected level when the player whose presence generates them is not in the building. The attendance figures may reflect a full house, but the revenue potential of a full house is not realized equally in every game. A building full of fans who feel deceived by the organization they traveled to support is not generating the same commercial energy as a building full of fans who received exactly what they were promised. Stephanie White's public statements across the media sessions surrounding this period have created a separate layer of institutional exposure that compounds the reporting compliance issues. The inconsistencies between her various characterizations of Clark's availability, her offensive philosophy and how Clark fits within it, and her lineup decision-making rationale have been documented across multiple appearances. The WNBA's injury reporting framework does not apply only to the formal pre-game submission. It encompasses the accuracy and internal consistency of all public statements made by team personnel regarding player health status. When a head coach makes contradictory statements across different media appearances about a player's physical condition, those contradictions become documentary evidence of a reporting environment that cannot be reconciled into a coherent, honest narrative. That is precisely the kind of evidentiary record that the league office has both the authority and the institutional obligation to examine when determining whether a franchise has violated the spirit and letter of its reporting requirements. The Indiana Fever's organizational leadership, from ownership through the front office through the coaching staff, appears to have allowed a situation to develop in which the public communication about Clark's status is no longer consistent with what the physical and documentary evidence suggests is actually happening within the franchise's operational environment. The Simon family's ownership of the Indiana Fever places them at the apex of a decision tree that is becoming rapidly and consequentially more significant with every passing week. The asset they hold, the presence of Caitlyn Clark under a Fever contract during the most transformative commercial moment in WNBA history, is, in objective terms, the most valuable player franchise alignment the league has ever produced. The broadcast numbers, the merchandise revenue, the road game attendance premiums that Clark generates for opposing franchises across the league, the sponsorship valuations her presence enables, and the international media attention she commands are all quantifiable. They all point in the same commercial direction, and they all depend on one foundational condition, that the operational environment surrounding Clark is structured to support her continued engagement with this franchise. When a franchise player of this commercial significance declines to commit to a long-term extension, as Clark has reportedly done, that posture is not a passive data point. It is a professional athlete making a rational assessment of her institutional environment and preserving her contractual optionality while she continues to evaluate whether the organization around her is capable of functioning as a credible partner in her professional career. Every ownership group in professional sports understands what that signal means. It means the player is watching. It means the player is evaluating everything. And it means the organization has not yet provided sufficient evidence that it is built for her success. Allowing a front office culture and a coaching staff dynamic to systematically damage the operational relationship between the franchise and its most commercially significant asset is not a basketball decision. It is a business decision. And the trajectory of that decision, if current patterns continue, points toward an outcome that no commercial calculation supports. The WNBA League Office has clear and well-defined jurisdiction over what has been documented here. The injury reporting violation is established. The timeline is a calendar fact-checked against an unambiguous CBA provision. The franchise's failure to submit Clark's availability designation by the required deadline on the day preceding the Portland game is not a matter of interpretation or analytical inference. It is a documented compliance failure that the league has both the authority to investigate and the institutional obligation to pursue. The injury reporting requirement is not a bureaucratic formality. It is the structural mechanism through which the league protects consumers, maintains the integrity of betting markets, and ensures that the information environment surrounding game operations is honest and reliable. If that mechanism is not enforced with consistency and meaningful consequences, it stops functioning as a protection and becomes a suggestion that sophisticated franchises can elect to disregard whenever the financial calculation supports doing so. The league office must examine not only the reporting timeline, but the full evidentiary context surrounding Clark's designation, including the internal consistency of the franchise's public statements, the visual documentation of the practice environment, and the relationship between the pre-game reporting failure and the broader pattern of communication that has surrounded this situation. The Indiana Fever are currently operating within a narrow window of institutional opportunity that their own decisions are rapidly closing. They hold the most valuable player franchise alignment in WNBA history. They have a home market that, when Clark is playing and the franchise is functioning honestly and transparently with its consumer base, generates the kind of commercial energy that transforms franchises and elevates entire leagues. They have the ownership resources to construct a genuine championship-caliber environment around an athlete who, at this stage of her career, has the potential to define the next decade of women's professional basketball in the United States. But none of that potential is realized by suppressing injury designations to protect a single night's concession revenue. None of it is built by allowing internal coaching staff conflicts to metastasize into documented, publicly visible breakdowns in the relationship between the team and its most important player. None of it is preserved by offering the consuming public carefully worded medical language in place of transparent, honest communication about what is actually happening inside the organization. The fans who drove to Gainbridge Fieldhouse on a Wednesday night in June, who paid elevated secondary market prices because they believed Caitlyn Clark was going to play, who collected their parking receipts and bought their concessions and scanned their tickets, and then stood in a building waiting for a product that was never going to be delivered. Those fans are not metrics on a revenue spreadsheet. They are the constituency whose trust is the foundation of everything the Indiana Fever will ever commercially be. That trust, once structurally damaged, does not repair on its own. It requires acknowledged accountability. It requires transparent communication. It requires demonstrated, observable behavioral change at every level of the organizational structure, from ownership through the front office through the coaching staff. The alternative, the path the Fever currently appear to be traveling, leads somewhere specific. It leads to a franchise player who does not re-sign. It leads to a consumer base that stops believing the product. It leads to a regulatory record of compliance failures that the league cannot continue to overlook without institutional consequences of its own. The CBA language is clear. The timeline is documented. The questions are on record. The Indiana Fever's leadership has a decision to make, and the window in which making that decision correctly still produces a recoverable outcome is not going to remain open indefinitely. Drop your analysis in the comments. Does the Indiana Fever's failure to comply with the pre-game reporting requirement constitute a sanctionable CBA violation? What accountability mechanism should the league apply? Every informed perspective matters. Subscribe to Simply Explained for fully documented, CBA-grounded, analytically rigorous coverage of everything happening inside the WNBA.